Welcome to Battle Cry, where the blood, grit, and sacrifice of American warriors echo through the fiercest battles in American military history. From the first musket fired at Lexington to the firefights of Fallujah, we relive the turning points that shaped our freedom and incite patriotism. Stand tall, stand proud. The story begins now.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving into a conflict that, well, for many folks, is kind of a historical whisper, isn't it? The War of 1812.
Mm-hmm. It really is. Often overshadowed by the Revolution or the Civil War.
Right. But it was this true crucible that forged identities, redrew mental maps, and had these profound consequences across North America.
Yeah, and what's really striking, I think, is how your understanding of this war shifts so dramatically depending on whose perspective you take.
Exactly.
For some, it's a fight for survival. For others, just an inconvenient sideshow. And for others, still a completely devastating loss.
Totally. So our mission today is basically to cut through some of that noise, pull out the most important insights, and give you a shortcut to being, really well informed about why this seemingly forgotten war profoundly shaped the U.S., Canada, and the Native American nations caught right in the middle.
And we've got a good stack of sources to draw on here.
We do. Historical overviews, battlefield trusts, personal journals, even some interesting Reddit discussions that shed light on how people see it today. It's quite a mix.
It is. Should be fascinating.
So let's start at the beginning. How did a young United States, barely a few decades old, find itself declaring war, its first formally declared war against Great Britain, its old colonial master? What kicked it all off?
Well, it wasn't just one thing. You can't point to a single spark, really. It was more like a buildup, a combination of these ongoing maritime disputes, definitely American ambitions on the frontier, and this fierce drive to assert national sovereignty.
Okay, so break that down. Maritime disputes, what does that actually mean here?
It largely comes down to the British Royal Navy and impressment. See, Britain was locked in the Napoleonic Wars, huge conflict, and they were losing sailors left and right to desertion. Their solution: impressment, basically forcibly conscripting sailors. And they didn't just take British sailors, they started stopping ships from other nations, including American merchant ships, and just taking sailors. Often they seized actual American citizens.
Wow. Right off American ships.
Right off their decks.
Yep.
And the Chesapeake Leopard affair in 1807, that became the kind of the searing example. You had a British warship, HMS Leopard, stop an American naval frigate, the USS Chesapeake, just off Virginia. The American captain refused to let them search for deserters, so the Leopard just opened fire, killed 3 Americans, wounded 18.
Opened fire on a U.S. Navy vessel.
Yes. And then they boarded and seized 4 men. 3 were Americans, guys like Daniel Martin, William Ware. These stolen sailors became symbols. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was personal, an affront to national honor. Furious petitions, headlines screaming about British tyranny. It really galvanized people.
I can imagine.
And then you had the British Orders in Council on top of that, basically saying any merchant ship heading to a French port could be searched and seized, just piling on the restrictions.
The boiling over.
It is. And the real irony, Britain actually repealed those Orders in Council right before the U.S. declared war, but the news just didn't cross the Atlantic in time.
Wow. Too late.
Exactly. And beyond the sea, you've got the whole westward expansion issue. American settlers pushing west, running into fierce resistance from Native American nations trying to protect their lands.
Makes sense.
And the Americans saw the British hand in this. British forts, Detroit, Michilimackinac, Niagara were still on U.S. soil, technically years after the Revolution. British agents, traders, they kept ties with the tribe, sometimes supplied arms.
So the Americans felt the British were stirring up trouble on the frontier.
They absolutely did. They saw it as direct instigation, encouraging hostilities to block American expansion.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting politically, right? With the rise of the war hawks.
Precisely. This wasn't the old guard. This was a new generation, young, ambitious Republican politicians, mostly from the South and the West. Think Henry Clay from Kentucky, John C. Calhoun, Felix Grundy.
What was their deal?
They saw war as, well, necessary. Necessary to defend American honor, secure those maritime rights we talked about, and, crucially, to facilitate westward expansion. Maybe even grab some Canadian land while they were at it. They talked about honor as if it were flesh and bone. Very fiery rhetoric.
So they're really pushing for a fight, unlike, say, the Federalists in New England.
Oh, a completely different outlook. The Federalists, especially in New England, were heavily reliant on maritime trade. They were warning, war threatens commerce, credit, prosperity. They were dead set against it.
So President Madison is caught in the middle here.
He is. James Madison. He tried diplomacy. He really did. But the British, preoccupied with Napoleon, they scarcely listened, as one source puts it.
So his options are running out.
Pretty much. He's facing this chorus of pleas from the war hawks, this general throb of indignation in every town over impressment and frontier issues. And despite his own fears that a war could, shred the Republic's fragile fabric, he felt he had to act.
And he sends the war message to Congress.
June 1st, 1812. And the vote. It was incredibly close. The closest formal war declaration vote in U.S. history, 79 to 49 in the House, just 19 to 13 in the Senate.
Wow, really divided.
Deeply divided. The Federalists were furious, calling it Mr. Madison's War. Some in New England even started talking about secession later on. At the Hartford Convention in 1814, they were that opposed.
Okay, so war is declared, but the country's hardly united. How prepared were they, actually, to fight this war?
That's the key question. They went in with, let's say, immense ambition, but significant practical challenges. The early part of the war, it's really a story of, American disaster, just abysmal failure in many ways.
What went wrong?
Well, the U.S. Army looked bigger on paper than the British forces initially in North America, but it relied heavily on state militias. And these militias were often poorly trained, poorly armed, poorly led. Plus, there was this deep-seated American mistrust of a large, standing army.
Okay.
Communication was incredibly slow, fragmented. British defense planning, on the other hand, was actually quite good. They knew the likely invasion routes.
And this showed up pretty quickly.
Immediately. The humiliation at Detroit, July, August 1812, General William Hull, he's a Revolutionary War vet, invades Upper Canada from Detroit.
Right.
But he gets spooked. He hears about British forces teaming up with Native American warriors under General Isaac Brock and the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh. He feels an Indian massacre.
Yeah.
And Hull, described by witnesses as basically slumped on the ground, drinking heavily, just surrenders Detroit without firing a shot.
Surrenders an entire American city.
The only time in history a white flag was raised over an American city by an American commander before a foreign army. It was shocking. Hull was later court-martialed for cowardice, though Madison eventually pardoned him.
Unbelievable. Was that just a one-off disaster?
Unfortunately, no. The second attempt, the Battle of Queenston Heights on the Niagara River, October 1812. Another disaster. The commander, Stephen Van Rensselaer, was pretty inexperienced.
Okay.
The British side was led by Major General Isaac Brock again. He had this really diverse force. Black troops, Canadian farm kids, Grand River warriors. Brock himself gets killed, leading a counterattack shot by a sharpshooter. His men rally, shouting, "Revenge the general."
So the British morale holds.
It does. But the American militia on the U.S. side of the river, they panic. Many refuse to cross into Canada to reinforce their comrades. The American troops already across were forced to retreat or surrender. The British took almost 1,000 prisoners.
Oh, the militia wouldn't cross.
Refused, citing, their service was only for defending home soil. The personal journals from soldiers on both sides really paint a picture of the chaos, the fear, the human cost.
So 2 major invasion attempts fail spectacularly.
And then a third one basically fizzles out before it even starts. November 1812, General Henry Dearborn is aiming for Montreal. But again, the militia problem. 2/3 refused to cross into British territory. There are reports of American troops even firing on each other in the confusion.
Oh, my.
Dearborn just calls the whole thing off. The third American invasion of Canada. It never happened at all, as one historian put it.
So these initial military blunders really put America on its back foot, didn't they? What do you think was the biggest takeaway or the lesson for the American military after such a disastrous first year?
Yeah, it was brutal. The biggest lesson, that their whole approach, relying on these amateurish state militias, was just not going to cut it. It was a painful realization, but it forced a major reevaluation. It kickstarted the push towards building a more professional, regular army. That became crucial later on.
Okay, so a harsh lesson learned. But things didn't stay entirely bleak for the Americans, right?
Right.
You mentioned sparks of pride.
Right. While the land campaigns were floundering, things looked a bit better at sea initially. This is where you get the story of the USS Constitution.
Old Ironsides.
That's the one, a heavy frigate. It scored these really important morale-boosting victories early on, beat HMS Guerriere in August 1812, then HMS Java. The ship's thick oak hull actually repelled some British cannonballs, hence the nickname.
So these weren't just symbolic wins.
They were huge for morale, yeah, but also practical. They showed the U.S. Navy, small as it was, could actually stand up to the legendary Royal Navy in single-ship actions. It got so embarrassing for the British that the Admiralty actually issued secret orders telling their standard frigates not to engage the heavier American frigates one-on-one.
Wow, really?
Really. But it wasn't all victories. There was the tragic fight between the USS Chesapeake, a different Chesapeake than the one in the earlier affair, and HMS Shannon in June 1813.
What happened there?
One of the deadliest single-ship battles ever, apparently. The American ship was captured. The captain, James Lawrence, was mortally wounded. But his reported dying command,
Don't give up the ship.
exactly, became this incredibly powerful, lasting motto for the U.S. Navy. Even in defeat, it became a rallying cry.
So naval battles were boosting morale, but what about the land war? You mentioned the Western Front.
Yeah, things remained brutal there. Even before the war officially started, you had the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory then, clashed with Tecumseh's warriors.
Harrison claimed a big victory, right?
He did. Burned Prophetstown, Tecumseh's brother settlement. His reports painted it as decisive, fueling his own legend. But it also just enraged Tecumseh and his followers even more, pushing them closer to the British when war did break out.
Okay, and Tecumseh remained a major figure.
Absolutely, until 1813. But first, you get another pivotal moment for the Americans on the water, but this time on the Great Lakes.
No.
The Battle of Lake Erie, September 1813.
Right, Oliver Hazard Perry.
Young guy, only 30. He literally oversaw the building of an American fleet on Lake Erie. Oversaw every plank and sail, one account says.
Built his own fleet.
Pretty much. Then he takes this new fleet out, engages the British squadron. His flagship, the USS Lawrence, named after the captain who said, "Don't give up the ship," gets absolutely battered.
Oh no.
But Perry doesn't quit. He dramatically transfers his flag under fire, rowing in a small boat to another ship, the USS Niagara, takes command there, breaks the British line, and forces the entire British squadron to surrender.
Incredible.
And sends that famous message, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours." It was a massive, decisive victory. It secured American control of the Northwest Territory, basically cutting off British supply lines to their Western forces and native allies.
And that directly led to?
The Battle of the Thames, October 1813. Because Perry controlled the lake, Harrison could move his army. He pursues the retreating British and their native allies, led by Tecumseh.
And this is where Tecumseh.
This is where Tecumseh falls. Killed in the fighting. His death was just devastating. It effectively shattered the hope of united indigenous resistance against American expansion. A huge turning point, and a tragic one for Native American Confederacy hopes.
So the Americans gained control in the Northwest, but what about that Canadian border region where the invasions failed?
That area just descended into incredible brutality, especially for civilians. It became this cycle of retaliation. Remember, the Americans burned public buildings in York, Toronto back in April 1813?
Yeah.
Well, the British and their allies paid that back. In December 1813, they swept across the Niagara River into New York, burned towns like Lewiston, Buffalo, just torched them. Sources say nearly every building reduced to embers, leaving hearts in soot.
Just retaliatory burning of civilian towns.
Yes. Total war, almost. There are harrowing personal accounts, like from a British soldier named Shadrach Byfield. He was wounded, had his arm amputated without anesthetic. Just grim stuff, showing the reality for ordinary soldiers and civilians.
It sounds like the nature of the war really shifted there.
It absolutely did. This tit-for-tat destruction, as you called it, it really changed things. It wasn't just armies fighting armies. Civilian lives, homes, livelihoods, they became central to the conflict. It became a war that, burned homes more than generals' names.
And the fighting there continued?
Oh, yes. Culminating in the Battle of Lundy's Lane, July 1814, right near Niagara Falls. A really bloody, confusing night battle. Both sides kept feeding reinforcements in. Nobody really won decisively.
Just a slaughter.
Pretty much. One source calls it the worst kind of battle you could want to fight. Estimates are that maybe a third of both armies ended up killed or wounded. It just highlights the desperate, grinding nature the war had taken on by that point.
So while this brutal back and forth is happening on the border, the war also starts hitting closer to home for Americans further south, right?
Absolutely. The war comes right into the Chesapeake Bay and eventually to the nation's capital itself. It gets very real, very fast.
How did that happen?
You had British Rear Admiral George Cockburn. From 1813 into 1814, his squadron just cruised relentlessly up and down the Chesapeake, raiding towns, burning farms, looting. Places like Havre de Grace, Maryland, St. Michael's, they really sowed terror and demonstrated just how fragile its security truly was.
And this is where enslaved people started seeking freedom with the British.
Exactly. Hundreds, maybe thousands, of enslaved African Americans saw the British ships as a chance for freedom. They fled plantations, rowed out to the British fleet.
And the British welcomed them.
They did. They offered liberty in exchange for service. They formed the Corps of Colonial Marines, basically, units of formerly enslaved men fighting for the British.
Wow. How are they viewed?
By the American South. With absolute dread, sources say these black men in redcoats were infinitely more dreaded than any of the British troops. It speaks volumes about the fear of slave insurrection.
Did the British keep their promise of freedom?
Largely, yes. Though, interestingly, after the war, under the Treaty of Ghent, the British eventually paid the U.S. compensation for the property, the enslaved people they had lost. A grim reminder of the times.
Okay, so raids, escaped slaves, and then the big one. Washington, D.C.
August 1814. This was a direct consequence of Napoleon's defeat in Europe earlier that year. Britain could now send veteran troops to North America.
Ah, reinforcements.
Big time. General Robert Ross leads a force that lands in Maryland. They rout the American militia at the Battle of Bladensburg, sometimes called the Bladensburg Races, because the militia fled so fast.
Ouch.
And then they march, essentially unopposed, right into Washington, D.C.
Unopposed into the capital.
Pretty much. And their orders were clear. Retaliation for the American burning of York, Toronto.
So they burned Washington.
Systematically. Public buildings only, mostly. The White House, or President's House, as it was known. The Capitol Building, which housed the Library of Congress. The House, Senate, Supreme Court. The Navy Yard. They set them ablaze.
The image of the White House burning.
It's iconic. And you have the famous story of Dolly Madison saving that big portrait of George Washington just before the British arrived.
Right, saving the portrait.
But the burning itself, it wasn't just wanton destruction. It was calculated. Strategic theater, as one source calls it, designed to demoralize the Americans, expose their weakness, humiliate the government.
The burning of Washington, D.C. sounds like a devastating blow, a real moment of national vulnerability. But was the British campaign successful across the board? Or did they meet further resistance after that shocking event?
Well, they certainly tried to press their advantage. Their next target was Baltimore, a much larger city, a major port, and crucially a hub for American privateers, those privately owned armed ships that were harassing British shipping. The British called Baltimore a den of pirates.
So they expected another easy victory.
Perhaps. But Baltimore was ready. They put up a much stronger defense than Washington had.
How so?
Two parts, really. On land, at the Battle of North Point, Maryland militia actually put up a stiff fight. They delayed the British advance and significantly killed the British commander, General Ross.
The same General Ross who burned Washington.
The very same. His death was a blow to British morale and leadership. Then the British Navy tried to take the city by sea, focusing on Fort McHenry, which guarded the harbor entrance.
And this is the famous bombardment.
Exactly. For 25 hours, the Royal Navy just pounded Fort McHenry. They used mortars, heavy cannons, firing 200-pound cannonballs, and these things called Congreve rockets.
Rockets. In 1814.
Yeah, early military rockets. Not very accurate, apparently, but definitely intimidating fiery streaks across the night sky. Imagine the psychological effect.
Must have been terrifying. Did the fort surrender?
It did not. Major George Armistead and his garrison held out. Despite the relentless bombardment, the fort's defenses held, and the British ships couldn't get close enough to force a surrender or support the land troops effectively.
And this leads to the Star-Spangled Banner.
This is the exact moment. Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer, was on a British ship trying to negotiate a prisoner release. He watched the whole bombardment through the night. And then, at dawn, seeing the huge American flag still flying over the fort.
That inspired the poem.
Inspired his poem, Defense of Fort McHenry, which of course was later set to music and became the Star-Spangled Banner. That moment, the flag's still there after all, that it wasn't just symbolic, it really did ignite this sense of unity and resistance, a massive, much-needed morale boost after the humiliation of Washington.
So Baltimore holds. A major turning point, it seems.
A very significant American success, yes. It checked the British momentum in the Chesapeake. And meanwhile, another kind of struggle was happening far away.
The peace talks.
Exactly.
Yeah.
While all this fighting, burning, and anthem-inspiring was going on, diplomats from both sides were meeting in Ghent, Belgium, trying to hammer out a peace treaty.
But the war wasn't over yet.
Not by a long shot. Even as they talked peace, Britain launched its largest invasion force of the entire war into northern New York, down Lake Champlain. Governor General George Prevost led this massive army. The goal was likely to seize territory to use as leverage in the Ghent negotiations.
Okay, this sounds serious.
It was, but the key wasn't the land battle. It was the naval battle on Lake Champlain. The Battle of Plattsburgh, September 1814. An American naval squadron, commanded by Thomas MacDonough, met the British fleet that was supposed to support Prevost's army. MacDonough won decisively. He outmaneuvered and outfought the British ships. Once the British lost control of the lake, Prevost felt his supply lines were too vulnerable, and he controversially ordered his large army to withdraw back to Canada.
So the naval victory stopped the huge land invasion.
Essentially, yes, it was another profound and symbolic moment. Showed American resilience again, and news of this defeat significantly weakened the British negotiating position back in Ghent.
So things are finally winding down.
The pieces are falling into place for peace. On December 24th, 1814, Christmas Eve, the Treaty of Ghent is signed.
And what did it say? Who won?
That's the fascinating part. It was really a document of compromise. There was no triumph for either side written into the text. It basically just restored the status quo antebellum. Meaning everything went back to the way it was before the war started. Status quo, the state in which. Antebellum, before the war. No territory changed hands officially in the treaty.
Wait, so after all that fighting, burning, dying,
Yeah.
nothing changed. What about impressment? Native American lands?
Nope. Those thorny issues, the ones that arguably started the war, they were essentially set aside, just ignored in the final treaty, deferred for later discussion, or allowed to fade away.
That seems anticlimactic.
It does on paper, but history rarely fits neatly on paper.
Right.
Yep.
And this brings us to that really interesting bit of timing. The strange lag between peace made and peace felt.
Precisely. News traveled slowly back then. Sailing ships across the Atlantic in winter, it took weeks.
So people in America didn't know the war was over.
Not for quite some time. And crucially, Andrew Jackson, commanding American forces down south near New Orleans, didn't know. Neither did the large veteran British force that was preparing to attack the city.
Oh, right, the Battle of New Orleans.
January 8th, 1815.
Right.
Weeks after the peace treaty was signed in Ghent. Jackson leads this incredibly diverse American force state militia, sure, but also free African Americans, Choctaw Native American allies, Jean Lafitte's pirates, Army regulars.
Pirates. Really?
Really, against a larger, experienced British army under General Edward Pakenham. And the Americans achieve this absolutely stunning victory, just devastating for the British. Pakenham himself is killed.
Even though the war was technically over.
Yep. A stunning but ultimately pointless victory in military terms because the peace was already agreed upon. But for American morale, immense.
How so?
It was seen as this miracle win against the odds, against Wellington's veterans who had beaten Napoleon. It cemented Andrew Jackson as a national hero, propelled him towards the presidency eventually. And because news of the victory arrived around the same time as news of the peace treaty, many Americans conflated the two. They felt like they'd won the war decisively at New Orleans.
Even though the treaty was basically a draw.
Exactly. Perception became reality for many. It completely shaped the American memory of the war.
So reflecting on all of this, what was the lasting impact? If the treaty was just status quo, how did this war actually change things?
That's where it gets complex. Because even if the treaty looked inconclusive, the war itself became this hugely defining moment. It profoundly shaped national identities and set the stage for big changes across North America.
How did that play out differently for, say, the U.S. versus Canada?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the war fostered these really distinct, often conflicting national narratives. For the Americans, it quickly morphed into the Second War of Independence.
Even though they didn't win concessions in the treaty.
Right. They focused on the successes, the naval victories like the Constitution, Perry on Lake Erie, the defense of Baltimore, and especially that smashing victory at New Orleans. The narrative became the young United States had gone toe-to-toe with the world's superpower, the British Empire, and hadn't lost. they'd survived.
So it boosted nationalism.
Massively. You see this surge in patriotism, this shared story of struggle and resilience. It helped unify the country internally, at least for a while. The Federalist Party, discredited by their anti-war stance and the Hartford Convention flirtation with secession, basically collapsed. This ushered in the so-called era of good feelings, a period of one-party rule.
Interesting. Any other long-term effects in the U.S.?
Definitely. It fueled this burgeoning American cultural identity, people like Ralph Waldo Emerson telling Americans, hey, look to yourselves, not Europe, for your models. Think the American scholar, self-reliance. It also really cemented an expansionist foreign policy. You get the Adams-Onis Treaty soon after, buying Florida from Spain in 1819. And then the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 basically telling Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. is asserting itself.
And militarily, after those early disasters?
The war brutally exposed the weaknesses. Relying on militia was painfully clear to be inadequate. So you see serious investment in developing a more professional U.S. Army and Navy. And economically, the British blockades forced the U.S. to develop its own domestic industries, reducing reliance on imports.
Okay, so for the U.S. nationalism, expansion, professional military, domestic industry. What about the Canadian perspective?
For Canadians, or what was then British North America, the narrative is completely different. For them, the war was a clear victory. Why? Because the main goal was survival, avoiding being conquered and annexed by the United States.
And they succeeded.
They absolutely did. They successfully defended their land against repeated American invasions.
Yeah.
Fighting side by side English Canadians, French Canadians, First Nations allies, British regulars helped sow the seeds of a distinct Canadian identity. Separate from Britain, yes, but definitely separate from the United States. It forged a sense of shared experience and a proud military heritage.
Makes sense. And the British view.
For Great Britain, honestly, it was mostly seen as an inconvenient sideshow, a frustrating distraction from the main event, which was defeating Napoleon in Europe. They were almost blissfully unaware of how important the war felt in North America.
That's sideshow, really.
Largely, yeah. They didn't get drawn into a disastrous, prolonged conflict in North America. They ultimately defeated France, and while relations with the U.S. remained a bit prickly for decades, they generally improved after Ghent. So from London's perspective, outcome, not bad.
Okay, so we have the U.S. feeling like they won a second independence, Canada feeling like they successfully defended their existence, Britain feeling like it was a minor issue, handled reasonably well. Who actually lost?
This raises the crucial and often overlooked question. Who truly lost this war? And the answer, tragically, is clear. The Native American nations.
How so? Weren't they allies of both sides?
They fought bravely on both sides, yes. But their interests, their sovereignty, their land claims, they were ignored almost entirely in the Treaty of Ghent, completely left out of the negotiations.
So the treaty offered them no protection.
None. And Tecumseh's death at the Thames, as we discussed, was that devastating blow to united indigenous resistance. The war effectively broke the back of organized, large-scale Native opposition to American expansion east of the Mississippi.
And the war accelerated that expansion.
Massively. It reinforced the American belief in manifest destiny, the idea that they were destined to expand across the continent, and it paved the way directly for policies like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law just 15 years after the war ended.
Leading to
widespread forced displacement. The Trail of Tears is the most infamous example. Broken treaties, loss of ancestral lands, cultural erasure, loss of languages, traditions, sacred sites, forced assimilation. The frontier became less a meeting place and more a battleground where Native communities desperately tried to defend their way of life against overwhelming pressure.
It's a tragic legacy.
It truly is. Stories like that of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe in California, while later, exemplify this long pattern of loss of land and loss of traditions that really gained momentum after 1812. Indigenous resistance continued, of course, but the war was a catastrophic turning point. Their struggle is a vital, often silenced part of this story.
So this deep dive really shows that the War of 1812, yeah, maybe it looks like a draw on paper, but it was anything but simple or inconclusive for the people who lived it and for those who came after.
Absolutely. It was chaotic, it was brutal, deeply transformative. It fundamentally reshaped the political and cultural landscape of North America, created new national feelings in the U.S. and Canada, but tragically altered the course for Indigenous peoples.
What really stands out is just how different the story is depending on where you're standing when you tell it.
It's a powerful reminder that history is never monolithic. It's complex, contested, and the echoes of these past struggles, these different narratives of victory and loss, they absolutely continue to shape our present day in ways we might not even realize.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Maybe the next time you hear the Star-Spangled Banner, or maybe you drive past an old battlefield marker somewhere, take a second. Consider how deeply this forgotten War of 1812 still resonates. It really reminds us that building nations, drawing borders, forging identities, it's often a very messy, very human story, with consequences that stretch far beyond the treaties and the timelines.
You have been listening to Battle Cry. Join us again next time.